Before hunger came, the poorest people in Ireland ate like this. A grown man would sit down to a meal of nothing but potatoes and a mug of buttermilk, and he would eat 10 pounds of them in a day, and he would be strong. Travelers who came to Ireland wrote home astonished at how tall the Irish were, how healthy, how straight their backs, on a diet the rest of Europe would have pitied. The potato had made a whole people robust on almost nothing. And then, in the autumn of 1845, a gray rot crept across the fields, the leaves blackened overnight, and when they dug the ground, the potatoes came up as stinking pulp. What follows is not a list of recipes. It is a record of what the Irish were driven to eat when the one thing keeping them alive turned to poison in the soil, while the country around them still grew food it was not allowed to keep. Every one of these kept someone's ancestor alive long enough to have descendants. Long enough, maybe, to have you. Start where they started, with the lumper. This was the potato of the poor, a big, watery, coarse variety that grew where nothing else would and fed a family off a scrap of rented ground. A cottier could raise enough on a single acre to feed his wife and children for most of a year. They boiled them over the fire and tipped them onto a basket set on the family's knees, and everyone ate with their hands from the common pile, skins and all, because the skin held what little goodness there was. When the blight took the lumper, it did not take a luxury. It took the entire foundation of life for 3 million people in a single season. And here is the part that turns hunger into something worse. Ireland went on producing grain and cattle and butter all through those years. The food was there. It was simply leaving. Because while the people ate ROT, the harvest sailed. All through the famine years, ships left Irish ports loaded with wheat, oats, barley, butter, and living cattle, bound for England, and in some seasons they left under armed guard because the government feared the starving would seize the food that was grown on their own land. An entire people went to their knees for want of bread, in a country that was, the whole time, a net exporter of food. That is the fact the Irish have never forgotten and never will, and they are right not to. The blight was an act of nature. What was done with the rest of the harvest was a choice made by men. Buttermilk was the first thing lost after the potato. The thick, sour milk left from churning had been the other half of the old diet, the thing that turned plain potatoes into something a body could live on for years, giving the protein and the calcium the potato lacked. But when the crop failed, the rents still came due, and the cow was the first thing sold or seized to pay them. Once the cow was gone, the buttermilk was gone with her, and the family was left with neither the potato nor the thing that had made the potato enough. The diet did not shrink. It collapsed from both ends at once, and much of what pulled it down was the rent collector, not the blight. Nettles came next, and for many, they came first of all, the wild things. The stinging nettle grows in every ditch in Ireland, and in spring it rises green and thick when nothing else has. Folk memory holds that 3 plants above all kept people alive when there was nothing else, and the nettle was the first of them. Boiled hard until the sting was gone, it made a thin green pottage that filled the belly and held a little iron and a few vitamins that kept the worst of the sickness at bay a while longer. There is a bitter mercy in it, that the same ditches lining the roads to the workhouse were furred green with the one food a starving family could gather for free. Charlock was the second of the 3. Country people called it praise-ach or prusia, a wild yellow weed that farmers curse when it chokes a field of grain. In good years, it was pulled up and thrown away. In the hunger, it was gathered by the armful and boiled. and a man in Donegal a century before had already recorded finding a whole family eating boiled charlock for breakfast, and tasted it and found it nauseous. In the Great Hunger, nauseous did not matter. People walked miles to gather the weed they had spent their lives destroying, and it held them upright one more week. Carrageen was the third, and it came from the sea. This is the reddish moss that clings to the Atlantic rocks, Irish moss, and boiled in water, it releases a jelly that sets like a weak pudding. Along the shore, it was one of the few reliable things left, carrying iodine and minerals a starving body was desperate for. Mothers boiled it down for children and the sick, a pale, trembling jelly that was sometimes the only thing a dying person could keep down. Of all the famine foods, it is the one that survived into better times, still eaten in Ireland today. Though few who spoon it now remember, it was once the last thing between a family and the grave. Dulce sat beside it on the same rocks, a darker red seaweed torn from the stones at low tide, eaten raw and salt-tasting, or dried in the sun. In parts of the west and north, it had always been a small part of the diet. In the hunger, it became a meal in itself. If your people came from the sea-facing edges of Donegal, or Antrim, or the islands, they very likely lived stretches of those years on what they could pull off the wet rocks with cold hands, and Dulce was near the top of that short list. Kelp was the harsher harvest. The great brown leathery seaweed the coastal families had cut for generations to sell, burned down to ash for soap and glass, now went into the pot instead of the market. It was tough and bitter, and needed long boiling to soften into anything a person could swallow. It was never a food anyone chose. You turned to it when the thing you sold to buy food could no longer be sold, because no one was left with money to buy it, and so you ate your own livelihood off the rocks. Limpets were the shellfish of last resort, the small conical shells clamped hard to the rocks between the tides, prized off with knives and boiled into a thin gray broth. They were tough and poor eating, but they were protein, and protein had all but vanished from the land. Whole coastal communities lived on limpets and periwinkles and whatever the tide left, and to this day there are places on the Irish coast where you can see the middens, the great heaps of empty shells, marking where the starving came down to the shore to eat what the sea would give. Periwinkles came up with them, the little black sea snails gathered by the bucket and boiled and picked from their shells with a pin. In ordinary times, a poor man's snack. In the famine, dinner for anyone who could reach the coast. The cruelty was that most could not. The worst of the dying was inland and in the west, and a family in the middle of the country, miles from any shore, could not walk to the sea on legs already failing. The shellfish saved some. It could only ever save those the tide could reach. Mussels clung to the same stones and went into the same pots, giving more flesh and more strength than a limpet. But shellfish beds could be stripped bare in weeks by desperate people, and there are accounts of whole stretches of coast picked clean, the rocks scraped down to nothing, because everyone within walking distance was living on the same few yards of shoreline at once. What the sea gave, it gave only until too many hands came for it. Seabird eggs were for the brave and the doomed both. On the great sea cliffs of the west, men lowered themselves on ropes to the ledges where the gulls and guillemots nested, and some of them fell, and some of the ropes broke, and men died gathering breakfast 100 feet above the surf. It was dangerous work that had always been done. In the hunger, it was done by men already weak with starvation, whose hands could no longer grip, and the sea took its share of them along with the potato and the fever. Fish should have saved them, and this is one of the cruelties people rarely speak of. Ireland sits in some of the richest fishing waters on Earth, and still the fishing folk starved. The boats were small, built for close inshore water, and could not reach the deep shoals in bad weather. Worse, in the hunger, the desperate had pawned everything, and nets and lines and even the boats themselves went to the pawnbroker for a few days' food. A fisherman who has sold his net to eat this week cannot catch fish next week. The sea was full, and the men who knew it best sat on the shore with nothing to cast. Indian meal was the government's answer, and its own ordeal. This was maize, corn ground coarse, shipped from America and sold cheap through the depots, a grain the Irish had never seen and did not know how to cook. They called it Peel's brimstone for its hard yellow color and the way it tore at insides, used to soft potato. And the man who took control of relief, Charles Trevelyan, the Treasury official who held the purse, wrote openly that he would not let the Irish grow, in his words, habitually dependent on the government, and on that principle he shut the food depots and turned back relief. He saw the blight, he wrote, as a mechanism for reducing surplus population. The maize was calories where there had been none. But it came late, it came short, and it came from a hand that had already decided how many were allowed to live. Stirabout was that Indian meal made survivable, a porridge of the maize meal steeped cold, then boiled, sometimes with a third part of rice or oats, cooked long and slow until it thickened. By the summer of 1847, 3 million people in Ireland were being kept alive each day on a ration of stirabout and a small slice of bread, doled from the relief works and the kitchens. 3 million, a third of the country, standing in line for a bowl of boiled corn in a land that had fed itself on its own soil within living memory. The soup kitchen was where the stirabout was ladled, and it became the strange center of the hunger. In Dublin, a celebrated French chef named Alexis Soyer built a model soup kitchen at the edge of the city, and it fed as many as 5,000 people a day, each filing past a great steaming boiler for a portion. The doctors of the day tore the soup apart, calling it soup of pretense, thin stuff with barely any meat, more show than sustenance, a salve for rich consciences. They were not wrong, but 5,000 a day drank it, and for many it was the only warm thing that passed their lips, and a thin soup is not nothing to a person who has had nothing at all. The relief soup itself was arithmetic more than cooking. The great pots were built to feed hundreds, and the proportions survive. 100 gallons might hold 92 gallons of water, and only small weights of flour and turnips and parsnips and beet and onions, boiled into something stretched across 800 hungry mouths. There was almost nothing in it. It was water flavored with the memory of vegetables, and its job was not to nourish, but to keep a body going one more day. Those who lived on it too long grew the swollen gums and loosening teeth of scurvy, because the pot that saved them from starving could not save them from the slower sicknesses of a diet with nothing living in it. Treacle and water stood in for milk once the cow was long gone. A spoon of dark treacle stirred into water gave a child something sweet and a few thin calories, handed out in the workhouses in place of the buttermilk their parents had grown up on. It rotted the teeth and filled nothing for long, but a starving child takes sweetness where it is found, and a mother with nothing else will give it. There is a world of grief in that substitution, in reaching for a jar of treacle, because the animal that once stood in the yard was sold to pay the rent on the ground beneath their feet. Blood was taken from the living cattle, in the places where cattle still lived. This is an old practice, older than the famine, bleeding a beast without killing her, and cooking the blood into a kind of pudding or cake so the animal survives to give again. In the hunger, it came back hard. On the very estates where herds were being fattened for export while the people starved, the desperate would bleed the animals in the field by night, mixing the blood with a little meal or a handful of herbs and frying it into black cakes. There is no sharper image of the whole catastrophe than that. Cattle raised on Irish land to be shipped to England for profit, and the Irish who worked that land creeping out in the dark to steal a bowl of blood from the beasts, because the meat itself was never, ever for them. Old cabbage leaves and the tops of turnips, the parts thrown to pigs in ordinary years, went into human pots now. The coarse outer leaves, the greens, the woody tops of root vegetables, anything with a shred of nourishment that had once been animal fodder was boiled for the family instead. There are accounts of a man so starved that he fell on a tub of raw cabbage and meal set out for pigs and ate until he died of it, his body no longer able to bear the shock of food. That is not a story about greed. That is what hunger does to a person driven long past the edge of what a body can survive, and there are more such stories than anyone would wish to count. Wild greens filled out whatever pot there was. Dandelion, sorrel, watercress from the streams, wild garlic in the woods, chickweed, the young tops of hedgerow plants, all of it torn up and boiled into the thin green messes that were the true daily food of the hunger for those with no coast and no relief within reach. Some of it held real goodness, the watercress and the sorrel especially, small doses of the vitamins that held scurvy at arm's length. Most of it was simply bulk, a way to fill a stomach and quiet a child. Greenery boiled soft over a fire in a cabin that had long since eaten everything that grew in rows. Grass, at the last, is the one the folk memory will not let go of. In the worst places, in the worst months, people ate grass. It cannot nourish a human body. It passes through and takes more than it gives. But a starving person does not reason. They only need the mouth to be full and the gnawing to stop for a moment. And so the accounts come down to us, from priests and relief workers and the survivors themselves, of the dead found by the roadside with their mouths stained green. It is the detail that says everything the numbers cannot. That is the floor of human hunger, and thousands of Irish people reached it in the year they would come to call black 47. Dogs and cats went into the pot in the towns and along the roads, and no one who has not been that hungry has any standing to flinch at it. The household animals disappeared first, then the strays. Around Skibbereen, one of the worst-hit places in all of Ireland, they ate the donkeys, and a grim nickname stuck to the people there for generations after. These were not people without shame. They were people whose children were dying in front of them, who would eat anything that had ever breathed if it bought one of those children another day. Rotten and diseased meat was eaten too, when nothing else offered, and it carried its own death in it. A starving family that found a pig or a sheep dead of sickness in a ditch would take it and cook it and eat it, knowing and not caring that it might carry fever, because the certain death of starvation outweighed the possible death of the meat. Much of the dying in the famine was not hunger itself, but the fevers that swept through bodies too weak to resist them, and the spoiled food was one more door the sickness came through. People chose it anyway. When both roads lead to the grave, you take the one with food on it. The workhouse gruel was the food of those who had surrendered everything, and this is the part that still burns in the telling. To enter the workhouse, a family had to give up their land and their home, and at the door they were split apart, the men from the women, the children from their mothers. Inside waited a watery meal of Indian corn or oats, thinner than the kitchens gave, served in buildings so packed with the sick that fever ran through them like fire. And the cruelty reached even the smallest. There are records of children jailed in brutal conditions and whipped for the crime of stealing a piece of bread, punished as thieves for being hungry in a country stripped of its food. The gruel kept some alive. But the workhouse was where a great many went precisely to die, indoors and counted, and the meal they ate there was the last thing they tasted. And the last food of the famine was the one eaten on water. On the emigrant ships, the coffin ships, where 1 million people fled the hunger across the Atlantic, the food was a hard sea biscuit, a ration of water, and whatever meager stores a family carried aboard. The crossing took weeks, packed below decks in the dark, and the fever came with them, and a fearful number never saw the far shore. But those who did, who stumbled off those ships into Boston and New York and Quebec and Liverpool gaunt and grieving and alive, carried the whole memory of it with them. The taste of nettle and charlock and cornmeal, the sight of the green-stained roadside dead, the knowledge of exactly what their family had eaten to reach that gangplank. They carried it in silence, most of them, because some things are too heavy to hand to your children. And so it was lost. That is why this is not a list of recipes. Every food here is a measure of how far a people were driven, from the potato that once made them strong, down through the ditches and the rocks and the relief pot, all the way to the grass by the road and the biscuit on the ship. And none of it, not one bite of it, happened in a country without food. The grain ships sailed the whole time. The cattle were fattened for export the whole time. 1 million died, and 1 million more fled from an island that was, on paper, feeding an empire. The blight came from nature. The famine was made by men who decided which mouths were worth filling. But here is the thing worth sitting with, the thing that outlives the anger. If you are watching this and you have a drop of Irish blood, then someone in your line lived through exactly this. Someone ate the nettle and the seaweed and the cornmeal that tore them apart, buried children they could not feed, and walked onto a ship with nothing and survived, because if they had not, you would not be here to hear their story. You are the proof that they made it. And most of us do not even know their names. We do not know which townland they walked away from, or which of these foods kept them alive, or where their parents lie in ground that no longer remembers them. They are the reason we exist, and they have gone nameless. And that is the last cruelty of the hunger, that it swallowed even the memory of the ones who survived it. So do the one thing that undoes a little of that. Ask. Ask the oldest person in your family what they remember while you still can. Find the county, the parish, the name on the ship's register. Because every name you pull back out of that silence is a small defeat handed to everyone who ever decided the Irish were not worth feeding. And tell me here, too. Where did your people come from, and when did they leave? If your family carried down a memory of the hunger, a food a grandmother would never let anyone waste, a story of the crossing, a name, say it in the comments. Because those memories are thinning with every year that passes, and this is a place they can be kept. Say the name if you have it. Give one of the survivors their name back tonight. Subscribe to blame your ancestors.